I think I was always a child of home economics years. So, as a little child, I learned to knit and I learned to sew. And I've always had a passion for history. I don't know why, but I'm fascinated by the story of people's past. And so as I grew up, it was always part of my being and who I was. And this was just a marvelous fit. I was an at-home mom with little kids, and I had been making lace, making bobbin lace, when I heard that there was a collection over at CSU, and I knew I had to see it. And that led me into going to graduate school, which allowed me to fall into this job, which turned into a life's passion that almost makes me cry. It's just so powerful because it ties my life together from beginning all the way through to today. My roles here overall, well, I've always been the curator of the museum in its manifestations as it grew and developed and became what it is today. But I also spent time being interim department head, being sandwiched between Kevin Olgenbruns, who was interim for a while, and then Mary Luttrell, who came after me and became permanent department head, who was a wonderful advocate for us. So principally, I was in charge of what you see around us and taught courses related to this, as well as other textile courses. I taught sewing labs, I taught textile labs. I was kind of the jack of all trades, because I think I grew up at a time when these were the sorts of classes, again, that I took and that I always had a passion for. I was a graduate student in this department from 1986 to 88. And it was at this time that powers beyond me, because I was just a student, were putting together a real plan for the collection. They decided to form a gallery there in the Gifford Building, name it after Dagmar Gustafson, who had been department head at one time of textiles and clothing, and who also had been an avid collector. She was the one I think we all credit with having started the whole collection simply by bringing in the things that she felt passionate about, that she collected on her own. And so I was fortunate to be part of that growing identity that also then included a Friends of the Gustafson Gallery. And as a graduate student, I was the one student member on that committee working with wonderful women such as Van Link, who was the wife of Al Link, then provost of the university. And it was just a wonderful growing opportunity for me. And that's how I got my foot in the door. When I graduated, my mentor, my major professor, Janet Hethorn, was leaving the university, and there was a recognized need to have some continuity in the care and in the visual person of the gallery. So I was really fortunate to be the right person, or maybe not even the right person, but the person there at the right time to take over and have the opportunity to work and develop this incredible museum. It's been 24 years. This is the most magical person in the whole wide world, Jack Kerfman. Jack Kerfman is someone who makes me want to cry because he is so incredibly special. He is a man of incredible genius, extraordinary modesty. He has angel's wings under his jacket because he does magical things in support of designing and explaining and putting together museum exhibitions. I've been privileged to work with Jack. He can do it all, oftentimes in the middle of the night. I can remember spending a lot of late nights with him, but putting together an exhibition in which I could bring him the artifacts and say, this is the story I want to tell. And I could watch Jack ideate. I could watch him think about it, put together a vision of what it should look like that would be inviting to the viewer, would draw them in, and would allow them to see what he was seeing, even as he just was putting it all together. He's a special person. Well, there are lots of dear, dear colleagues that are part of my life story here at the university. Among them, Pat Wilson, who taught textiles, who was one of my professors as a graduate student and has remained a good friend. Jan Else, who taught historic textiles until she retired, and then I was allowed to take that over. So she certainly was a very strong person in my career here, as well as a donor, as well as a strong supporter of the museum in general. And then there's my buddy Yolanda. I met Yolanda when she was an undergraduate and I was a graduate student. And I was in charge of activities in the collection. All students had to work in the collection, those students taking historic costume. And I knew Yolanda was an exceptional seamstress, extraordinary designer. And I actually had her take a bodice, the lining of which was totally shattered. It was a wonderful silk iridescent lining, but just crumbling. I had her take some organza and completely line the inside of that bodice. And I made her use threads from the fabric to sew it in. She has reminded me of that for the last 24 years, but she's been the best friend as well. One of the real milestones of my career here was my opportunity to meet Mr. Blackwell and get to know him and his partner, Spencer. They were, I think, monumental in what we were able to do here, what we achieved here. I first met them right after I started working. I think it was the summer of '88. And they came into town having heard that we had a large Blackwell collection. Not that they'd given it to us. It had come to us originally from the Jenkins family, who owned Kate's First Avenue in Cherry Creek. They had worked with Mr. Blackwell and collected him. And they gave us, in honor of Sally Haxton, 50 garments by Mr. Blackwell. And when he heard this, I think he figured instead of a flyover from Los Angeles to New York, he'd stop in Denver and find out what was going on here. And that was really the beginning of, I think, a really special relationship. Initially, he was a pretty frightening character. He was bombastic and bullish, and I didn't particularly care for him, but realized that we had something special going on here and wanted to pursue it. So deciding that he had to put his pants on just like all the rest of us, proverbially one leg at a time, we developed phone conversations, we began talking and invited him to come back. And he came back in the mid-90s and we had the most extraordinary show. In the Opera Galleria, we put on an exhibition for one night only called Outrageous Blackwell. And we set up twinkle lights in the trees and mannequins everywhere, and we had champagne and hors d'oeuvres. And Mr. Blackwell walked around being charming, actually, and holding my hand and talking about what he did and what he designed. And that same trip, he came for a week and spent part of that time teaching students. That was really powerful. That was so special. He would walk down the halls in the morning and the students would say, "Good morning, Mr. Blackwell." They felt they owned him. He belonged to them, and it was just really exciting to see. He came into classes and turned his garments inside out and showed students how he had done it, how he had perfected the fit and the construction of it. He talked about succeeding in business in a really difficult field. And then we had a reception for him, and he sat down and he talked to every single student who wanted to talk to him. He asked them what they wanted to do, who they wanted to be, what their goals were. It was incredibly gracious. He understood and appreciated how important education was for them. An education he didn't have, but had learned, on the, I don't know what the word is, he had learned on the way. And he was just a magical person. He kind of follows us all the way through then, the development of the museum. We had a huge retrospective here in this new gallery once we moved over here. We did another project with Mr. Blackwell, after he gave us all of his master patterns and all the scrapbooks chronicling his career, we redesigned his clothes using newer techniques and kind of adjusting them to a patron's needs. He was most impactful as making us who we are. And I think one of the important things I learned was that the list, which was what he was known for, the worst dress list annually, was a marketing technique. It was a joke, and he knew that. And yet it became an overwhelming sort of identity for him. And what we found was a skilled craftsman, a designer who could talk fabrics and talk style and design, and who was really quite an innovator. He was marvelous, and it remains my goal to help bring that information to the forefront, as opposed to Mr. Blackwell, oh, that funny list. Oh, what an obnoxious. He called me a school marm. We were at the Opera Gallery, and he was going to give a little talk, and I'm standing there, and I was a school marm. And he's picking on me, and what he said was, you always pick on the person in charge. You don't pick on powerless people, because that's devastating. You hurt them. You pick on the person that everybody else is going to think, that's pretty funny. And that's what he did. He called me a school marm. He made fun of me, and it was great fun. It was marvelous. Yeah, it was good.
Being a school marm to Blackwell sounds like it might be easy to be a school marm.
I think it would be. You know, he was nice about that. He didn't pick on people. He didn't judge the way we looked. That was part of a gig that was separate. And so he was real special. I adored that man. Donors are such a unique group of people. Donors who give financially to support what we're doing. Donors also who bring us objects, things they've treasured and saved. I've always said it's like Christmas. They bring in the most astounding things, and they share them with us. And they share the stories behind those things. One of my favorite one was an 1896 bustled wedding dress. It was extraordinary and came kind of rumpled up. It had been in a bag or something. And yet it came with a story of early settlers here in Fort Collins. So it was the generosity of those sorts of people that I think have overwhelmed me over my career here. The graciousness, the generosity, the sharing of stories, but also recognizing that we'd take care of them and we'd share them with students. We'd keep them so that they were preserved and cherish the memory and the stories that came with them. Among many of those people was a woman whose name I'm not going to use. She's the principal of the Avenir Foundation, from which we take our name. She was donating to this facility, to the collection in the mid-'70s, and has a passion for textiles and clothing, and over the years graciously gave us lots and lots of treasures, family treasures that go back a couple of centuries. And when she learned that we were going to do this, we were going to move, she started talking to us about how could she help us, how could she support our endeavors. And she has really made it possible for us to be in this spot, grow the space we're still growing, and attract other donors, people who see this success and want to be part of it and want to contribute as well. She's very special, and I wish I could tell you more about her. I have to credit how all that started, because I didn't do a lot of traveling for a lot of years, but when Mary Luttrell came as department head, she was quite instrumental in moving this collection and this museum forward and helping foster travel opportunities, not only for me, but for other faculty. We went to places that were textile rich. I spent 30 days in India as part of a Fulbright group, looking at tie-dye, looking at ikat weaving, generally immersing ourselves in textiles. I've been twice to Uzbekistan, and again, another extraordinary experience. And part of all this travel that was also really special was that once donors heard about it, I was often supplied with funding to purchase textiles. That was a unique opportunity. I could buy them directly from the weaver or from the tie-dye master. That allowed us to build this collection, knowing what we needed and what we wanted, given the direction we saw ourselves going in, to really make it happen. I've traveled to Peru and visited weavers there, to Guatemala. I can go back to Azerbaijan, back in the Central Asia. It's just been a fairly extraordinary opportunity to see textiles in their original place, to talk and to watch artisans who come from a tradition that could go back 9 or 10 generations, skilled beyond any of our comprehension. It's pretty exciting. The Avenir Foundation made an initial gift of $1.25 million to help us move over here. We had done some successful grant writing, and we're still short of really being able to open it up. We would have been here, but not really capable of or able to adequately store it and use it. That initial gift really helped us get on our feet. As we moved forward in time, given our new space and given our new exposure, there was a recognition that we needed a larger space and that we needed additional staff. And so we began conversations with the Avenir Foundation again about how would they be willing to help us in taking the next step forward in the growth of the museum. Always recognizing that there was the expectation that we were also working with other entities and that they were not the sole support of our museum. Again, thinking about success breeding success. Others coming and joining our endeavors because we had someone who was certainly impressed with where we were going and what we were doing. I looked at teaching, and I taught 3 classes. I started teaching historic costume as soon as I became employed here. Then, as I said earlier, I began teaching historic textiles several years later, and then also taught a museum studies course. My goal in all my teaching was to build the enthusiasm that I felt for my textiles, for the textiles around me in students, to give them an understanding that there's a whole wide world out there and a great deal of skill, a great deal of knowledge that sometimes we dismiss, being maybe ethnocentric or nationalistic, if that's the right word. I wanted students always to look beyond themselves, to appreciate what other people did and could do, and were still doing. I wanted them to be able to look at costume and see the history behind it, that it wasn't just pretty clothes, or clothes they thought were pretty, or clothes they thought were hideous, but that it was also about the history of the time, the politics, the environment, exploration, all of those things. I don't think there's anything more important than textiles and clothing as far as world history is concerned, and how it can come alive. When you can look at an artifact, when you can look at a garment or a textile, you can see the person behind it, and it makes that person come alive, so it makes history come alive. I think that's exciting, really exciting. There's been no greater joy than to have students come back and see you, or to send you an email or a text. Not so much text, to have them come back to you and say, I thought of you, I was in the Louvre, or I was someplace in the world, and they've been lots of places, they travel marvelously, and say, I thought about you, I saw this, and I remembered you. They may not have all the details, but they had still succeeded because they knew something that allowed them to be more curious. I had one student who was coming back from some kind of spring break or some trip out to California, and she brought me a cotton boll stick, right out of the field. She had gone out into a field where she saw the cotton drying on the plants, and she knew I'd want it because that had been part of our class and something we had talked about and looked at. And so it was that recognition that they'd learned something. They could go to the movies and I'd be happy if they could say, I knew that wasn't right, or it was really marvelous and I could tell what was going on. That's the joy that students bring you when they recognize, and when you learn that they recognize that there was really something there. I'm thrilled with the people who are still here at the museum and maybe carrying on my work, maybe moving it to a new level, which I think is even more exciting. They bring skills and more education and experiences that I didn't have or did as part of on-the-job training. Megan Osborne is certainly the top of that list. She started working with me and had done her undergraduate work here, as a matter of fact, in the department. She did her master's and then came back to Colorado, and I was fortunate to have some soft money funding to hire her while we were moving over here. And then recognizing how valuable she was as a collections manager, was able to, with the support of the college and the department, hire her and keep her here. She has the passion for this. She has a love for it. She enjoys people's stories and history. And so she is really the top of my list of who should be here and bringing this and moving this museum forward. She's a pretty special person to me. There are a number of things I'd love to say to people who will see this video. First of all, I hope I look all right. But more importantly, I want them to remember a couple of things. Well, but first let me start with this. I'm going to start over again. There are several things I'd like alumni to remember. First, this is a special university, and they need to recognize that and be glad that they graduated from this university. They need to come back, and they need to visit us on a regular basis. And then I want to say thank you, because they allowed me to pursue my passions. They provided that constant enthusiasm that kept me going and kept me growing, and I am grateful for that. And then there are a couple of other things they need to know and be reminded of that I told them. First of all, clothes make the man. Naked people have very little influence in society. That always gets them thinking about what they're wearing and what's around them when they could dismiss it otherwise. I think that's Mark Twain. And the other very important lesson for them to learn was women did not wear togas.